This is Awaab Ishak, with a cake almost as big as him on his second birthday. 8 days later, he died in hospital. And this is the reason. The mould-riddled housing association flat in Rochdale that was his home. If his parents' complaints had been acted on, Awaab would have lived. Today, as the inquest ended and a coroner said their son's death should be a defining moment, the family's lawyers spoke their words for them.
We cannot tell you how many health professionals we've cried in front of, and Rochdale Borough Housing staff we have pleaded to. We shouted out as loudly as we could. We have no doubt at all that we were treated this way because we are not from the country and less aware of how the systems in the UK work. Rochdale Borough-wide Housing, we have a message for you. Stop discriminating, stop being racist, stop housing people in homes you know are unfit for human habitation.
For all of Awaab Ishak's short life, he lived here, breathing in air filled with spores in a one-bed flat on Rochdale's freehold estate, which is owned and managed by the area's biggest social housing provider. On many occasions, Awaab's parents asked for something to be done about the mould in their flat. There was even a letter from a health visitor to the housing association. She'd seen the state the flat was in. She pointed out the health risks, especially to children, and she said they needed to be moved. But that didn't happen. The only work done to try and solve the problem was by Awaab's father. He'd been told to paint over the mould, but it kept coming back. In July 2020, 5 months before Awaab died, the Housing Association inspected the flat, but there were no repairs. The mould was put down to the family's lifestyle and bathing habits. Today, the inquest findings were clear. That was not the problem.
I think there's been a 40-year culture in the social housing sector amongst landlords that has sometimes seen, and indeed amongst private landlords, that has sometimes seen reports of damper mould dismissed too lightly, kind of blamed on the residents' lifestyle choices. It's unfair, it's patronising, it's stigmatising, and it can impede proper action and the landlord taking responsibility for things that it should be doing to prevent damper mould.
The landlord in this case is Rochdale Borough-wide Housing. Managers giving evidence at the inquest talked about the housing shortage, long waiting lists and budgets and costs. Today in a statement they said the level of risk was not recognised, but lessons have been learned and they support diverse communities.
Yeah, so my name is Gareth Swarbrick. For the last 10 years I've been RBH's Chief Executive.
Our request for an interview with the RBH Chief Executive was refused.
All this whataboutery, all this, oh, if only we had more government money. Do your job, man. The chief executive of this organisation was responsible. He was warned, his organisation was warned. There is no excuse for having people in the UK today living in homes which are in this condition.
We want to end by telling you who our beautiful Awaab was. He was always full of smiles. He liked to joke and was full of life and laughter. His absence leaves a huge void.
Well, earlier I spoke to Kwejo Twinaboa, who began campaigning on behalf of some of the country's worst-off tenants after watching his father spend his dying days in a cockroach-infested housing association flat. And they asked him if he thinks this will be a defining moment for the housing sector.
I hope so. I really, really do. From my experience over the last 18 months, I would have thought Grenfell, more than 5 years ago, would have been the defining moment. But what we've seen is more than 5 years on, we're now sat here today talking about this young boy who has died as a result of the negligence of his landlord. I really do hope this is enough for real change to come about, but I don't think it will really come about until criminal charges are brought against landlords, allowing young people and tenants to live in squalid conditions and putting their health and safety at risk. I mean, Awaab unfortunately paid the ultimate price, and that was with his life.
I want to ask you the question that the coroner posed, which was, how could this happen to a 2-year-old boy in this day and age, dying because of exposure to mould?
It's failures at multiple levels, but it's very, very common. I mean, we know that his home was visited by staff from the housing provider, but still that wasn't enough for things to be done.
What Awaab's parents have said is that they shouted as loudly as they could, but felt that they weren't being heard. But they've also alleged that racism played a part. Now, the Housing Association have said that they support the diverse communities of Rochdale. But in your experience, the people you stand up for, does racism sometimes play a part?
I mean, absolutely, and housing providers will stick that on their website. I mean, we're talking about Rochdale borough-wide housing. I looked at their mission statement and they said they provide great houses for their tenants, but we've seen in this case, unfortunately, that proves otherwise. And in terms of racism, I have no doubt that there's a role to play, especially within social housing, because I've been up and down the country and spoken to tenants who are managed by many different housing providers, and often they are from black or ethnic minority backgrounds, and they've said the same in many cases. My dad would say the same if he was still here. He had to change his name, or use an English name rather, when he used to phone up our housing providers to be taken seriously. And I've spoken to other tenants that have said they've done the same. They're not sure it's because of their colour, their skin, their background, their class, but I have no doubt that racism plays a massive role. I mean, you look at the people in social housing, the demographic of people in social housing, and then you look at the directors' boards at these housing providers, and you contrast them yourselves. They're completely on different spectrums.
What happened to your dad, and how much did racism play a part in that then?
So we lived in social housing the majority of my life. My dad unfortunately passed away. He was diagnosed with cancer, but we were living in a social housing property that was full of damp, mould, mice, asbestos, cockroaches. We had a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old that was rotting. We had a bathroom which wasn't fit for use, and he had nurses coming in to feed him 3 times a day and were struggling to bathe him. That's how bad things were, and we had been complaining of the conditions. They were well aware of the fact that he was dying in those conditions, but did absolutely nothing. And in the beginning of 2020, he passed away, and I had to take on that fight.
Rochdale borough-wide housing say they've had hard lessons to learn. But isn't one of the lessons the easiest one? It's just to listen.
It may have been a learning experience for them, but to that family, to the mum and dad, they've lost a son. Their son has died. I mean, a learning experience would be forgetting to give a customer change back when you're at work. When it's cost the life of a 2-year-old due to negligence, that isn't a learning experience. And in this situation, I have no doubt that it's corporate manslaughter, and I think criminal charges do need to be brought about for real change, because if it's not, we're going to see this happen time and time again. We'll be back here month after month talking about similar cases until landlords, bad landlords, are really and truly held to account, and we show them that this cannot continue to happen.
Well, there are calls now for a change in the law for landlords to treat investigating mould in the same way they do gas safety and Legionella.
Yeah.
What do you think can actually make a difference?
We're past sorries, we're past lessons being learned. Lessons should have been learned after Grenfell. I think landlords need to be held accountable, and fines aren't enough, especially when it's costing social housing tenants lives. I think if it was any other sector like the NHS, people would be struck off. People would be going to jail for negligence of this scale had it been in the NHS. And I think the same needs to happen in social housing and housing in the housing sector at this point.
Kwejo Tuanaboa, thank you very much for speaking to us.